The rain in Seoul didn't fall, it descended like a heavy, suffocating velvet curtain, blurring the neon lights of Gangnam into smears of distorted color. For Alara, the color didn't matter. To her, the world was a symphony of sounds, textures, and the rhythmic tapping of her white cane against the slick pavement. She had lived in the city for 3 years, teaching English and finding a strange kind of peace in a place where she was an outsider twice over. First, by her skin, and second, by her silence. But tonight, the symphony had turned into a cacophony. The wind howled through the skyscrapers, drowning out the echoes she relied on to navigate, and the torrential downpour turned the familiar streets into a treacherous landscape of invisible traps. She stood at the edge of a busy intersection, her breath hitching in her chest as the roar of engines and the splashing of tires against puddles disoriented her. The tactile paving under her feet felt slippery, and for the first time in a long time, Alara felt a cold, sharp blade of fear pierce her heart. She stepped forward, trying to find the rhythm of the crossing, but her cane caught on a jagged piece of debris brought up by the storm. Her foot found only empty air where the curb should have been. With a short, stifled gasp, she plummeted forward, her hands reaching out into the void before she crashed into a shallow, muddy roadside ditch, her cane clattering away into the darkness, leaving her truly and utterly alone in the dark. The mud was cold, clinging to her skin and soaking through her coat, but it was the silence of her lost cane that terrified her most. She tried to push herself up, her fingers clawing at the wet earth, but her ankle throbbed with a white-hot intensity that made her vision swim even in its perpetual blackness. She cried out, her voice swallowed by the thunder, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt like a ghost in a city of millions, a flickering light about to be extinguished by the rising water and the indifference of the night. Less than 50 yards away, a procession of 5 black luxury sedans cut through the storm like a line of predators. In the back seat of the lead car sat Kang Min-jun. He was a man whose name was whispered in the corridors of power with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. As the head of the most formidable syndicate in the country, his heart had long ago been forged into something resembling obsidian, hard, cold, and impenetrable. He stared out the tinted window, his eyes reflecting nothing but the passing gray blur of the city he owned but never truly felt part of. His life was a series of calculations, betrayals, and the heavy weight of a crown that required him to be less than human. "Sir, there's an obstruction near the drainage works," his driver murmured, his voice tight with the discipline of a soldier. Min-jun didn't look away from the window, but then a flash of something caught his eye. Not a color, but a movement. A frantic, desperate struggle in the mud. Usually, he would have ordered the driver to swerve and continue. His life was too dangerous for detours, and his enemies were always watching for a moment of weakness. But as the headlights swept over the ditch, they illuminated a pair of hands, dark, trembling, and reaching upward, as if searching for a god that had abandoned them. "Stop the car," Min-jun said. The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. "Sir, it's not safe. We are behind schedule for the meeting with the Busan delegates." "I said stop," Min-jun repeated, his voice dropping an octave. The convoy screeched to a halt, the sudden silence inside the car vibrating with tension. Before his security detail could even react, Min-jun threw open the door. The rain lashed at his face, instantly soaking his bespoke Italian suit, but he didn't seem to notice. He strode toward the ditch, his polished shoes sinking into the grime. His men scrambled after him, hands on their holsters, scanning the rooftops for snipers, but Min-jun saw only her. Alara heard the car doors, the heavy thud of footsteps, and the sudden presence of someone towering over her. She pulled back, her back hitting the cold concrete wall of the ditch, her sightless eyes wide and brimming with tears. She expected a harsh word, or perhaps to be ignored, but instead, the air around her changed. The scent of expensive sandalwood and rain-washed ozone filled her senses. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Minjun looked down at the woman. She was covered in mud, her hair matted, her clothes ruined, yet there was a haunting, ethereal beauty to her that felt like a physical blow to his chest. He saw her discarded cane floating in a puddle nearby and understood instantly. For the first time in 20 years, the cold stone in his chest cracked. He didn't say a word. He simply reached down. His hands, which had signed death warrants and broken bones, were infinitely gentle. He slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she were made of spun glass. Alara gasped, her hands instinctively clutching at his lapels. She expected the rough fabric of a worker, but her fingers met the impossibly soft wool of a high-end suit and the cold, hard metal of a watch that felt like a masterpiece of engineering. She felt the strength in his arms, a terrifying absolute power, yet he held her with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "You're safe," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through her entire body. It wasn't the voice of a savior. It was the voice of a king who had decided, on a whim, to be a god. He carried her past his stunned bodyguards, who stood frozen in the downpour. They had seen him kill without blinking, but they had never seen him touch a stranger with anything other than violence. He didn't take her to a hospital where questions would be asked. He placed her in the back of his own car, shielding her head with his hand as he slid her onto the heated leather seats. He sat beside her, shouting a single command to the driver to return to the estate. As the car accelerated, Alara sat huddled in the corner, shivering violently. She felt the warmth of the car's climate control, but the shock was deep. Suddenly, she felt a heavy, warm weight being draped over her shoulders. It was his jacket. It smelled of him, dark, masculine, and safety. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper over the hum of the engine. Minjun looked at her, watching the way she tilted her head, trying to map him with her ears. He saw the dried mud on her cheek, and without thinking, reached out with a thumb to brush it away. His touch was electric. "A man who doesn't like to see things broken," he replied quietly. He didn't tell her he was a ghost. He didn't tell her he was a monster. In the sanctuary of the darkened car, as the rain hammered on the roof, two worlds that should never have touched began to bleed into one another. Alara didn't know she had just been rescued by the most dangerous man in the country, and Minjun didn't know that the woman he was holding was the only person in the world capable of destroying him. The iron gates of the Kang estate groaned open like the jaws of a sleeping giant, welcoming the convoy into a world of shadowed luxury and absolute silence. As the car slowed to a halt, Alara felt the change in the air, the heavy dampness of the street replaced by the scent of pine, expensive stone, and the terrifying stillness of a fortress. She was still wrapped in his jacket, the warmth of it the only thing keeping her from shattering. When the door opened, the rain was a distant hum, kept at bay by a massive portico. Again, those strong, certain arms reached for her. She didn't pull away this time. There was a gravity to this man, a pull so visceral that her body seemed to recognize him as a sanctuary before her mind could even process the danger. He carried her through the vast foyer, the sound of his boots echoing off the marble floors like steady heartbeats. Ilara could hear the frantic whispers of servants, the crisp rustle of suits as men bowed. She could feel the waves of shock radiating from the people around them. They had never seen their master carry anything, let alone a woman who looked like she had been pulled from the wreckage of a storm. Minjun ignored them all. He ascended the grand staircase, his breathing even, his grip never faltering. He took her to a room that smelled of old books and dried lavender, a place that felt softer than the rest of the cold stone house. Gently, he set her down on a bed that felt like a cloud. Alara's hands immediately went out, searching the space around her, her fingers grazing silk sheets and the carved wood of a headboard. She felt small, a dark speck of mud in a palace of white and gold. Min Jun stood back, watching her. He watched the way the dim light caught the curve of her jaw and the trembling of her hands. For the first time in his life, he felt a crushing sense of intrusion, as if his very presence was too loud for her fragile grace. He called for a female physician and a maid, his voice snapping the household back into a state of urgent obedience. "Wash her," he commanded, his voice low and raspy. "Treat her ankle. If she sheds a single tear because of your roughness, you will answer to me." As the staff scurried to obey, Min Jun retreated to his study, but he didn't sit. He paced. He looked at his hands, still damp from the rain and stained with a bit of the mud from her coat. He should have been at the meeting. He should have been planning the retaliation against the Choi syndicate for the shipment they intercepted in Incheon. Instead, his mind was filled with the image of Alara's sightless eyes, eyes that seemed to see more of his soul than anyone with perfect vision ever could. He felt a strange, terrifying ache in his chest, a phantom limb of an emotion he thought he had amputated years ago. An hour later, he returned to her room. The doctor had gone, reporting a minor sprain and exhaustion. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering embers in the fireplace. Alara was sitting up in bed, dressed in a soft, oversized silk robe they had found for her. Her hair had been cleaned and dried, and she looked like a fallen star. When she heard the door click, she didn't flinch. She simply turned her head toward the sound, her expression one of quiet, haunting stillness. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation of his presence, as if she could feel the weight of his gaze. "This is my home," Min Jun replied, walking closer until he was standing at the foot of the bed. "You have nothing to fear here." Alara let out a small, weary laugh, a sound that hit him like a physical blow. A man who travels in a convoy of 5 cars and commands people with a whisper? I think fear is exactly what you trade in, Mr. Min Jun, he said, omitting his family name, the name that meant death in most circles. "And you are Alara. How did you know?" "I had your bag retrieved from the ditch. Your ID was inside." He paused, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her throat. "You are a long way from home, Alara. Why Seoul? Why stay in a city that doesn't care if you fall?" She reached out, her fingers finding the edge of the silk blanket. "Because in the Drak, every city is the same. But here, the silence between the noise is different. It's expectant. I like the way the wind sounds against the glass of the skyscrapers. It sounds like a chorus. But your silence is the loudest thing I've ever heard. It's heavy. It sounds like someone who has forgotten how to breathe for himself." The room went cold. Min Jun felt a surge of defensive anger, the instinct to lash out at anyone who dared to look behind his mask. But then he saw the way she wasn't judging him. She was simply feeling him. She was seeing the invisible chains he wore. He took a step closer, the tension between them thick enough to touch. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, before he finally allowed his fingers to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Alara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her skin like warm velvet against his cold palm. "Why did you stop?" she whispered, her voice a soft ache in the shadows. Min Jun leaned down, his face so close to hers that he could feel the warmth of her breath. "I thought I saw a light in the mud," he said, his voice a jagged edge of truth, "and I realized I've been living in the dark much longer than you have." For a moment, the world outside, the blood, the power, the looming war with the rival families, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the crackling fire and the rhythmic, synchronized breathing of 2 broken people finding a strange, dangerous resonance in the night. But even as Alara felt the safety of his presence, a shadow was moving in the hallways of the estate, A phone was ringing in a hidden corner, and a message was being sent to the very people Min-jun feared most. The lion had brought a lamb into his den, and the wolves were already circling the gates. The morning light didn't wake Ilara. It was the change in the texture of the air, the way the silence of the room felt expansive and gold-tinted. She lay still for a long time, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery on the silk duvet. The pain in her ankle had subsided to a dull throb, but the memory of the night before, the rain, the ditch, and the man with the voice of a velvet-covered storm, was vivid enough to make her heart race. She felt like a character in a fable, whisked away from the mud into a kingdom of shadows. When she finally sat up, the door opened with a soft, rhythmic click. "I have brought you breakfast, miss," a woman said. A woman, her tone polite but laced with a tremor of nerves. "The master's waiting for you in the conservatory when you are ready." Ilara allowed the staff to help her dress. They chose a gown of soft, cream-colored cashmere that felt like a second skin, and as she moved through the halls, she used her hands to map the walls. The estate was a maze of cold stone and warm wood, a fortress designed to keep the world out. When she was led into the conservatory, the air suddenly became thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and expensive tobacco. The sound of birds chirping behind glass walls created a fragile paradise. "You're late," Min-jun said. He was sitting at a glass table, the morning newspaper spread before him, though his eyes hadn't left Ilara since she stepped into the room. He watched her move, noted the way she tilted her head to catch the direction of his voice, and felt a strange, protective heat flare in his gut. To the world, he was a predator. To his enemies, he was a monster. But standing here in the morning light, Ilara made him feel like a man who was desperately trying to remember how to be kind. "I'm not used to waking up in a palace," Ilara replied softly, taking the seat a servant pulled out for her. "And I believe I still have your jacket. I should return it." "Keep it," he said, his voice dropping. "It looks better on you than it ever did on me." The meal was a quiet affair, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with questions they weren't yet ready to ask. Ilara ate with a practiced grace, her other senses heightened. She could hear the way Min-jun's breathing changed when he looked at her. She could hear the subtle clink of his ring against the espresso cup. "Why are you being so kind to me, Min-jun?" Ilara asked suddenly, her sightless eyes finding his with an accuracy that unnerved him. "A man like you don't just pick up broken things for no reason." Min-jun leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Perhaps I'm tired of seeing things stay broken, or perhaps I recognize a certain kind of strength in you, Ilara. You walk through a world of darkness without flinching. I live in a world of light, and I'm forced to blink every day." Their conversation was interrupted by the heavy tread of boots. A man entered, Daeho, Min-jun's second in command, his face a mask of scarred discipline. He leaned down and whispered something to Min-jun's ear. Ilara caught only fragments: the Choi shipment, Incheon docks, retaliation. The air in the room shifted instantly. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a cold, metallic tension. Min-jun's posture straightened, his muscles coiled like a spring. "Stay here," Min-jun told Ilara, his voice no longer soft. It was the voice of the boss now, sharp, commanding, and lethal. "My men will be outside the door." He left without another word, the glass doors swinging shut with a finality that made Ilara shiver. For the next several days, she was a prisoner in a golden cage. She heard the distant roar of engines at night, the muffled shouts of men in the courtyard, and once the unmistakable, terrifying crack of a gunshot echoed from the far side of the estate. She spent her hours in the library, her fingers dancing over braille books he had somehow procured for her within 24 hours. He was looking after her, even in the midst of a war. One evening, he returned late. Ilara was sitting by the fireplace in the main hall when she heard him enter. His steps were heavy, uneven. She stood up, her heart leaping into her throat. As he approached, the scent of sandalwood was drowned by something metallic and sharp. Blood. "You're hurt," she breathed, moving towards him, her hands outstretched. "It's not mine," he rasped, but he didn't move away. He let her hands find his chest, then his shoulders, and finally his face. Her fingers were cool against his heated skin. She felt a jagged cut along his cheekbone, the blood still tacky. "You live a life of monsters," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How do you sleep at night?" Min-jun grabbed her wrists, his grip tight, not to hurt her, but as if he were a drowning man grabbing onto a life raft. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't sleep, Ilara. I wait for the morning. But tonight the morning feels very far away." He looked at her then, at the softness of her lips and the pure, untainted worry in her eyes. He was a man who took what he wanted, a man who ruled through fear, but with her, he felt a terrifying vulnerability. He wanted to pull her into his world and hide her there, but he knew the shadows would eventually find her. "I should send you away," he muttered, his lips brushing against hers as he spoke. "For your own safety, I should throw you back into the rain." "Then why don't you?" she asked, her voice a challenge and a plea. "Because," he whispered, his hand sliding into her hair, "for the first time in my life, I found something I'm actually afraid to lose." He kissed her then, a desperate, bruising collision of two worlds. It was a kiss that tasted of iron and longing, of ancient pain and new hope. In that moment, the Mafia boss forgot his empire, and the blind woman forgot her darkness. They were just two souls clinging to each other in the eye of a hurricane. But as they stood locked in each other's arms, Daeho watched from the shadows of the balcony above. His eyes weren't filled with loyalty. They were filled with a cold, calculating greed. He saw the way his boss held her, the way the great Kang Min-jun had finally revealed his throat to an enemy. Daeho pulled out his phone and typed a single message to the head of the Choi Syndicate. "He has a weakness, a girl. The fortress is no longer impenetrable." The kiss changed the very air inside the mansion. It was no longer a fortress of cold stone and clinical precision. It became a place of haunting, breathless anticipation. For the next week, the war outside seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Min-jun found himself returning to the estate earlier and earlier, his men baffled as he cut short high-stakes meetings to sit in the library with a woman who couldn't see the suit he wore or the blood he had spilled to keep it. He began to show her his world through her other senses. He took her to the roof of the estate on a clear, crisp evening where the city of Seoul hummed far below like a distant beehive. He stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her waist, and pointed toward the horizon, describing the city not as a map of streets, but as a sea of lights. "The Namsan Tower is to our left," he whispered into her ear, his breath warm against the evening chill. "It's a needle of violet light piercing the clouds. And below us, the Han River looks like a ribbon of hammered silver reflecting the neon of the bridges." Ilara leaned back against him, closing her eyes as if that would help her visualize his words. "And you, Min-jun, if you were a part of this city, what would you be?" He went quiet for a moment, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly. "I would be the shadows between the buildings, the parts the light can't reach, the parts people are afraid to look at." "I'm not afraid to look at you," she said, turning in his arms. She reached up, her fingertips tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the bridge of his nose, and the faint, permanent crease between his eyebrows. You think you're a monster because that's what you've been told to be, but a monster doesn't have a heart that beats this fast when I touch him." Min-jun felt a lump form in his throat, a physical manifestation of a vulnerability he hadn't felt since he was a child, watching his father being led away in handcuffs. He told her then, in the safety of the dark, about his past. He spoke of the orphanages, the brutal streets of Busan, the way he had to kill his own emotions just to survive the night. He spoke of the loneliness that felt like a parasite eating him from the inside out until he was nothing but a shell of power. "I have everything," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I have the money, the land, the lives of 1,000 men in the palm of my hand. And yet, until I found you in that ditch, I felt like I was already dead." Alara pulled his head down, kissing his forehead, his eyelids, and finally his lips. It was a kiss of healing, a promise that she saw the man beneath the myth. They spent hours talking, the conversations stretching into the early hours of the morning. She told him about her love for music, the way she could hear the color of a cello, and how she had come to Korea to escape the suffocating expectations of her own life, though she remained mysteriously vague about what those expectations were. But the piece was a fragile glass ornament, and the first crack appeared 2 days later. Min-jun was in his study, reviewing the logistics of a new shipping route, when the alarm systems of the estate went off with a piercing, rhythmic scream. Within seconds, the sound of heavy gunfire erupted from the front gates. The Choi syndicate hadn't waited for a parley. They had come for blood, led by the intelligence provided by the traitor, Dae-ho. Min-jun didn't hesitate. He grabbed his weapon, but his first thought wasn't for his men or his empire. It was for the woman in the room down the hall. He burst into her bedroom to find her standing in the center of the floor, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a pillow. "Min-jun, what's happening?" she cried out, the terror in her voice cutting through him like a blade. "Stay down," he roared, lunging across the room as a spray of bullets shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows, sending shards of glass raining down like lethal diamonds. He tackled her to the floor, shielding her body with his own as the room was riddled with lead. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest, a frantic, terrified rhythm. He smelled the gunpowder and the smoke, but he also smelled her, the scent of lavender and the warmth of her skin. In that moment, the cold, ruthless boss was gone. There was only a man who would burn the entire world to the ground if it meant keeping this one person safe. "I have to get you to the safe room," he hissed, the sound of boots echoing in the hallway. The enemy was inside. He scooped her up, ignoring the glass cutting into his own knees, and sprinted toward the back of the estate. His guards were falling, the sounds of the massacre echoing through the marble halls. He reached the heavy steel door of the reinforced bunker, punched in the code, and shoved Alara inside. "Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me," he commanded, his eyes wild. "Don't leave me," she screamed, reaching for him, her fingertips grazing his sleeve. "Min-jun, please." "I have to end this," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "They think they can take what's mine. They have no idea what I'm capable of when I have something to lose." He shut the door, the heavy click of the locks sounding like a funeral bell. The battle that followed was a symphony of violence. Min-jun moved through his own home like a vengeful ghost, his movements precise and lethal. He found Dae-ho in the main foyer, the traitor holding a smoking gun over the body of a loyal guard. The look in Min-jun's eyes was something beyond anger. It was a cold, cosmic promise of suffering. But as the dust settled and the remaining attackers fled or were neutralized, a black car with government plates pulled into the blood-stained driveway. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a rival gang. A man stepped out, older, impeccably dressed, radiating a level of power that made even Mean June's empire look like a playground. He was surrounded by a phalanx of private security that moved with the precision of elite special forces. He didn't look at the bodies, he only looked at the front door of the mansion. Mean June stepped out onto the porch, his gun still in his hand, his clothes soaked in blood. "Who the hell are you?" The older man looked at Mean June with a cold, piercing gaze. "You have something of mine, Mr. Kang, and if you've allowed a single hair on her head to be harmed, there is no corner of this earth where you will be safe from me." Mean June froze as the realization hit him. He had been looking for a teacher, a girl who fell in a ditch. He hadn't realized he had picked up the runaway daughter of the most powerful business mogul in East Asia, a man who owned the very politicians and banks that Mean June's syndicate relied on to survive. The air on the porch was thick with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder and the heavy, humid scent of the dying storm. Min June stood his ground, his fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon, his chest heaving as he stared at the man who had just appeared like a specter of absolute authority. This wasn't a rival gang leader with a chip on his shoulder. This was Elias Thorne, a man whose name was etched into the glass of skyscrapers from London to Tokyo, a man who moved the world's markets with a single phone call. "You're her father," Min June stated, the realization landing in his gut like a lead weight. All the pieces shifted in an instant. Ilara's refined speech, her quiet confidence, the way she seemed to inhabit a different world even while sitting in a roadside ditch. She wasn't a lost traveler. She was a runaway princess who had fled a kingdom of gold for a life of quiet anonymity. Elias Thorne didn't flinch at the sight of Min June's bloody clothes or the carnage that littered the driveway. He looked at the Mafia boss with a clinical, icy disdain. "I have spent millions of dollars and 6 months scouring the globe for her," Elias said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of power. "I find her in a house of thieves and murderers, surrounded by the stench of death. Step aside, Mr. Kang. My patience is as thin as the air you're currently wasting." Before Min June could respond, the heavy steel door of the safe room at the end of the hall groaned open. Ilara emerged, her hand tracing the wall, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had heard the voices. She had heard the one voice she had spent her whole life trying to escape. "Father?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias pushed past Min June, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the marble. The transformation was instantaneous. The cold titan of industry vanished, replaced by a man gripped by a desperate, agonizing relief. He reached his daughter and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Ilara! My God, Ilara! We thought the worst." Ilara didn't pull away, but she didn't melt into him either. Her body remained stiff, her sightless eyes turned toward the direction where she knew Min June was standing. "How did you find me?" "You can't hide from me forever, little bird," Elias murmured, pulling back to cup her face. "Not when you use the accounts I set up for you, not when you stay in one place for too long. But look at you. You're hurt. You're in a place like this." He turned his head, casting a look of pure venom at Min June. "What did he do to you? Did he take you? Is he holding you for ransom?" "No," Ilara said, her voice gaining strength, echoing through the hollowed-out silence of the foyer. "He saved me. He found me in the rain when I had nothing. He protected me when the world you built for me failed to keep me safe." Min June felt a surge of something he couldn't name, a mixture of pride and a devastating hollow ache. He saw the way Elias looked at his daughter, and then back at him. The mogul saw the blood on Min June's hands, and for the first time he saw the way Ilara was leaning toward the sound of the Mafia boss's breathing. He saw the bond that had formed in the shadows, a bond that defied every law of the world he commanded. Regardless, Elias said, his tone shifting back to a professional coldness. This farce is over. You are coming home, Ilara. There are doctors, security, and a life waiting for you that doesn't involve hiding in the dark with criminals. I'm not going, she said, her voice a soft, unbreakable blade. You have no choice, Elias replied. He signaled to his men, who began to move forward. Min Jun's own remaining guards stepped into their path, their hands on their weapons. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, a hairline trigger away from a second massacre. Min Jun stepped forward, his eyes locked on Alara. He saw her fear, but he also saw her love, and he knew with a crushing certainty that his world was a poison to her. He was a man of the shadows, and she was a creature of light, regardless of the darkness her eyes lived in. If she stayed, she would eventually be caught in the crossfire of a war that would never end. Go with him, Ilara, Min Jun said. The words felt like they were being ripped from his lungs. She turned her head toward him, her expression one of pure betrayal. Min Jun, no. He can give you the world, Min Jun continued, his voice shaking. I can only give you a grave. Look at this house. Look at what happened tonight. I cannot keep you safe from the life I chose. You deserve to be where the light can find you. I don't care about the light, she cried out, her voice breaking. I found my light in you. Elias Thorne watched this exchange, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who understood leverage, and he saw that this mafia boss, this man he should have despised, was making the ultimate sacrifice for his daughter. He saw the raw humanity in the man he thought was a monster. Ilara, Elias said, more gently now, come with me. Let us get you treated. Let us find a way to handle this situation. If you stay here tonight, you will die in the next raid. Is that what you want for him? To watch you die because he was too selfish to let you go? Ilara stood frozen, the tears flowing freely now. She felt the weight of the choice. She felt Min Jun's presence, the heat of him, the scent of the man who had carried her out of the mud. She reached out one last time, her hand finding his. Min Jun took it, squeezed it with a strength that felt like a goodbye, and then, slowly, agonizingly, let go. Go, he whispered. He watched as Elias Thorne led her out of the mansion and into the waiting car. He watched the taillights disappear into the mist of the Seoul night, leaving him standing in a house of ghosts and the bitter taste of a victory that felt like the deepest defeat of his life. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence in the mansion became unbearable. Min Jun fell into a spiral of cold, efficient violence, tearing through the Choi syndicate with a brutality that shocked even his most seasoned soldiers. He was trying to kill the feeling of her absence, but the more blood he spilled, the more he realized he was only drowning in the memory of her voice. He didn't know that miles away in a penthouse overlooking the city, Ilara was facing her own war. She refused to eat, refused to speak, sitting by the window and listening to the sound of the wind, waiting for a symphony that no longer played. Her father watched her wither away, realizing that in saving her from the darkness, he had accidentally extinguished her soul. And then the phone rang in Min Jun's study. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a report from the docks. It was Elias Thorne. The business crisis you're facing with the government and the banks, I've made it go away. The Choi syndicate will be dismantled by the authorities by morning. I have given you back your empire, Mr. Kang. Min Jun leaned back, his eyes cold. Why? You hate me. I do, but I love my daughter more, and she is dying without you. She has a proposal for you, one that I find utterly abhorrent, but have agreed to facilitate. Come to the Thorne estate, now. The Thorne estate was a fortress of glass and steel, perched atop a hill like a modern-day Olympus. As Min Jun's car wound its way up the private road, he felt like an intruder from a lower world. The air here was thinner, cleaner, and devoid of the scent of gunpowder that had become his second skin. He was stripped of his weapons at the perimeter, his men left behind, until it was just him, the monster of Seoul, walking through halls of white marble and priceless art. He found her in a sunroom that overlooked the entire city. The afternoon light bathed her in a golden glow, making her skin shimmer like silk. She looked healthier than when she had left, but there was a stillness to her that pained him. She wasn't moving, she was simply existing. "Ilara," he said, his voice cracking the silence of the room. She didn't turn quickly. She let the sound of his voice wash over her first, her eyes closing as a small, trembling smile touched her lips. "I knew the wind would bring you back," she whispered. He moved toward her, his heavy boots silent on the plush carpet. He wanted to take her in his arms, to never let go, but he stopped a few feet away, mindful of the invisible wall her father's power had built around her. "Your father, he cleared my path. He ended the war. I owe him everything, and yet I have nothing to give him in return." "He didn't do it for you," Ilara said, standing up and reaching out. Minjun stepped into her space, letting her hands find his chest. "He did it because he saw that I was a ghost without you. He realized that all his money couldn't buy back the light in my eyes." They stood there for a long time, the silence filled only by the rhythmic thudding of their hearts. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the reality of their situation settled over them like a cold shroud. Minjun knew that even with the Choice Syndicate gone, his life was a revolving door of violence. New enemies would rise, new shadows would form. As long as he was the boss, he was a target, and as long as she was with him, she was the bullseye. "I can't marry you, Ilara," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I will never be able to give you a name that isn't whispered in fear. I will never be able to walk down a street with you without looking for a sniper on every roof. Your father is right. A life with me is a life lived in a bunker." Ilara pulled him closer, her face pressed against his suit. She didn't argue, she didn't cry. She had spent the weeks apart coming to the same heartbreaking conclusion. She was the daughter of a mogul, he was the king of the underworld. Their union would be a declaration of war against every social and political norm in the country. "I know," she whispered. "I know we can never have the life other people have. I know the ring I want can never stay on my finger without becoming a target." She pulled back then, her sightless eyes searching his face with a devastating intensity. Her hands moved to his neck, pulling him down until their foreheads were touching. This was the moment she had prepared for, the one request that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. "Minjun," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread of hope and sorrow. "If I cannot be your wife, if I can never officially stand by your side as the queen of your world, then give me something that is truly ours, something no one can take away, something that will be a part of you that stays with me when the shadows call you away." Minjun's breath hitched. "What are you asking me for?" "I want an heir," she said, the word hanging in the air like a prayer. "I want a child. I want to hold a piece of your soul in my arms, a boy who has your strength and your heart, but who is born of the love we found in the rain. Give me a son, Minjun. Let me raise the legacy of the man I love, even if I have to do it in the safety of this cage." The room seemed to tilt. Minjun looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the sacrifice she was making. She was willing to raise a child in partial hiding, to bear the weight of a secret life, just to have a physical manifestation of their love. It was the most romantic and most tragic thing he had ever heard. "You're asking me to bring a life into my world?" he asked, his voice shaking. "You know the danger he would face." "He won't be in my world," she replied fiercely. "He will be in mine. My father will protect him with his billions, and you will protect him from the shadows. He will be the bridge between the light and the dark. He will be our hope, Minjun. Please, don't let our story end with just a goodbye in the mud." Minjun felt the last of his defenses crumble. He saw the future in that moment, not of blood and iron, but of a small hand holding his. He saw a chance for redemption, a way to ensure that the cycle of violence ended with him and a new legacy began with his son. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep commitment that sealed their pact. It was a kiss that accepted the tragedy of their situation but embraced the beauty of the life they were about to create. Months passed in a blur of secret meetings and protective circles. Ilara moved back to a private, high-security villa owned by her father, where Min-jun visited her under the cover of night. He watched her body change, his hands resting on the swell of her stomach, as he whispered stories of the city to the life growing inside. He became a man obsessed with safety, purging his own ranks of anyone even remotely suspicious. He was no longer just a boss, he was a father-to-be, and his ruthlessness grew tenfold because he was no longer fighting for himself. But the underworld has a long memory, and betrayal often comes from those who feel neglected by a leader's change of heart. As the date of the birth approached, a new threat was brewing within Min-jun's own inner circle, a faction of younger, hungrier lieutenants who saw his devotion to Ilara as a weakness. They didn't want a boss who was distracted with love. They wanted a wolf, and they were preparing to strike at the very moment he was most vulnerable. The night Ilara went into labor, the sky over Seoul turned a bruised, angry purple. The rain returned, a haunting echo of the night they met. Min-jun was at her side, holding her hand through every contraction, his face etched with a mixture of terror and awe. "You're doing so well, Ilara," he whispered, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Is he here?" she gasped, her grip on his hand tight enough to bruise. "Is he coming?" With one final soul-shattering cry, the silence of the villa was broken by the sharp, healthy wail of a newborn. The doctor, a man sworn to absolute secrecy, lifted the child. "It's a boy," the doctor whispered. Min-jun took the baby, his hands trembling. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, the shock of dark hair, and the way the boy's eyes, though currently closed, seemed to mirror his own. He placed the child in Ilara's arms. She didn't need eyes to see him. She felt his warmth, the softness of his skin, and the steady beat of his tiny heart. She wept, the tears falling on the blanket. "My son, my beautiful, perfect son." But the moment of peace was shattered by the sound of an explosion at the perimeter of the villa. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in a world of red emergency flares and the sudden terrifying chatter of automatic gunfire. The betrayal had begun. The red emergency lights of the villa pulsed like a dying heart, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, where only moments ago a miracle had occurred. The transition from the sacred silence of birth to the violent roar of an assault was so sudden it felt like the world had been torn in half. Min-jun didn't panic. He transformed. The softness he had shown Ilara vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus that was terrifying to behold. He scooped the wailing infant from Ilara's arms, tucking the boy into a portable bassinet with a speed that spoke of a man who had spent his life preparing for the end of the world. "Stay behind the reinforced wall," Min-jun commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He pressed a heavy handgun into the hand of the terrified nurse and signaled for his two most loyal guards to flank the bed. "Min-jun, don't leave us!" Ilara cried out, her voice thin and raspy from the exhaustion of labor. She reached into the air, her fingers trembling as she tried to find the anchor of his presence. He paused for a heartbeat, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead. "I am the shield, Ilara. Nothing gets past me." He stepped out into the hallway, and the air was immediately filled with the acrid stench of smoke and the deafening rhythm of gunfire. It wasn't the Choi Syndicate. These were his own men, men he had trained, men who had eaten at his table. Leading them was Jinho, a young, ambitious lieutenant who had always seen Min-jun's recent distractions as a death sentence for the syndicate. To them, the baby wasn't a symbol of hope, it was a weakness that needed to be cut out. Min-jun moved through the villa like a whirlwind of vengeance. He fought with a savagery that surpassed anything he had ever done before. He wasn't protecting a territory or a shipment. He was protecting the only light he had ever known. But the betrayal was deep. The attackers knew the layout of the villa. A flashbang detonated near the master's suite, the white light and concussive force shattering the windows and throwing the guards backward. In the confusion, a stray spray of bullets ripped through the bedroom door. Ilara screamed, not for herself, but as she felt a hot, searing pain bloom in her shoulder as she tried to shield the bassinet with her own body. She slumped against the side of the bed, the world spinning into a cold, dark void that was even deeper than her blindness. Min-jun burst back into the room a second too late. He saw Jin-ho standing over the bed, his weapon leveled at the bassinet. The roar that erupted from Min-jun's throat wasn't human. It was the sound of a god falling from grace. He fired 3 times before Jin-ho could pull the trigger, the traitor falling back into the shattered glass of the balcony. Min-jun dropped his weapon and fell to his knees beside the bed. The baby was screaming, but he was unharmed. Ilara, however, was pale, her blood soaking into the white silk of the sheets, a crimson stain that looked like a blooming rose in the moonlight. "No!" Min-jun breathed, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. "No, no! Ilara, look at me! Stay with me!" He gathered her into his arms, his hands shaking as he tried to staunch the bleeding. For the first time in his life, the powerful Kang Min-jun was utterly helpless. He let out a choked, agonizing sob, his forehead resting against hers. "I promised you. I promised I would keep you safe. Please don't leave me in the dark. I can't go back to the dark." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the police, but the private medical and security force of Elias Torn, who had been alerted the moment the perimeter was breached. But to Min-jun, the world was silent. He sat on the floor, cradling the unconscious woman he loved and the son he had just met. A broken king in a ruined palace. He realized then that his power meant nothing if it couldn't protect the heartbeat of his soul. Ilara's hand moved feebly, her fingers grazing his wet cheek. "The baby," she whispered, her voice almost non-existent. "He's here. He's safe," Min-jun choked out. "You have to stay, Ilara. He needs you. I need you. I'll give it all up. I'll burn the empire to the ground. Just stay." As the paramedics rushed into the room, Min-jun stood up, his face a mask of tear-streaked iron. He looked at the chaos, the blood of his enemies and the blood of his love mingled on the floor. The wolf they wanted was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a man with everything to lose and the will to destroy anything that stood in the way of his family's survival. The days that followed the attack were a blurred montage of sterile white hallways, the rhythmic, haunting beep of heart monitors, and a silence so heavy it felt like lead. Ilara lay in a private wing of the city's most exclusive hospital, her life hanging by a thread thinner than the silk she used to wear. Outside her door, the 2 most powerful men in the country, the tycoon of the boardrooms and the king of the back alleys, sat in a silence that was no longer a standoff, but a shared vigil of grief. Min-jun had not slept, had not eaten, and had not changed his clothes. The dried blood of the men he had killed and the woman he loved had crusted into the fabric of his suit, a suit that now felt like a shroud. He sat with his head in his hands, the echoes of the baby's cries from the nursery down the hall the only thing keeping him from drifting into a catatonic state. He was a man who had built an empire on the idea that he was untouchable, only to realize that the more you love, the more surface area you provide for the world to hurt you. Elias Thorne looked at the broken man across from him. He saw the way Min-jun's hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of a soul finally feeling the gravity of its sins. "I have the best surgeons in the world in there," Elias said, his voice unusually soft. "You did what you could, Min-jun." Min-jun looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I brought the war to her bedroom, Elias. I let the darkness touch the one thing that was pure. I am not a protector. I am a magnet for ghosts." "Then stop being a magnet," Min-jun replied, leaning forward. "You have a son now, a legacy that isn't written in blood. The men who did this, they weren't just rebels. They were the symptoms of the life you lead. You cannot be the boss and a father. The world will not allow both to exist in the same body." That night, while Alara remained in a medically induced coma, Min-jun made a decision that sent shockwaves to the foundations of Seoul's underworld. He didn't call a meeting, he didn't send a messenger. He walked alone into the hidden club where the remaining heads of the city's syndicates had gathered to discuss his perceived weakness. He entered the room like a dead man walking, his presence extinguishing the laughter and the clink of glasses. He didn't pull a gun, he simply threw a heavy, scorched leather ledger onto the table, the records of every bribe, every route, and every contact he had built over 20 years. "It's over," Min-jun said, his voice echoing with a terrifying final authority. "The Kang Syndicate is dissolved as of this moment. The accounts are frozen, the routes are closed. If any of you or any of the men who served me so much as whisper the name of the woman or the child in that hospital, I won't just kill you, I will erase your entire history from this earth. I have nothing left to lose, which makes me the most dangerous man you will ever meet." He walked out, leaving the stunned predators in his wake. He had committed the ultimate sin of the Mafia. He had walked away for peace. But he hadn't walked away for peace. He had walked away to become a ghost, a guardian who would haunt the shadows to ensure the light stayed bright for his family. 3 days later, Alara's eyes fluttered open. The world was still dark, but she felt a warmth on her hand that she recognized instantly. "Min-jun," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "I'm here," he breathed, leaning over her, his tears falling on her hand. "The baby. Tell me about the baby." Min-jun reached into the bassinet that had been brought into the room under the tightest security. He gently lifted the infant, now 10 days old, and placed him against Alara's chest. The infant, as if recognizing the heartbeat he had listened to for 9 months, let out a soft, contented sigh and fell back into a deep sleep. "He has your nose," Min-jun whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And he has a spirit that survived a war before he could even see the sun. He is beautiful, Alara. He is the only good thing I have ever done." "What did you do, Min-jun?" she asked, her hand finding his face, sensing the change in him. "The air around you, it's different. It's lighter." "I gave them back the crown. I'm nobody now, just a man who loves you, just a father who will spend the rest of his life making sure this boy never has to learn the things I know." For a few weeks, they lived in a bubble of stolen time. In the high-security recovery wing, they were just a family. They named the boy Jihu, meaning wisdom and thick like a pillar. It was a name for a boy who would stand strong in both worlds. Min-jun learned how to hold a bottle with the same hands that had once held a blade. He learned how to hum a lullaby, his deep voice vibrating against the baby's chest, a sound that Alara said felt like the purr of a lion who had finally found home. But the nobody Min-jun had become was still a man with a target on his back. The power struggle he left behind had created a vacuum, and in the underworld, a vacuum is always filled with blood. One of his former lieutenants, a man who felt cheated from his inheritance, had tracked them. He didn't want the ledger, he wanted the head of the man who would abandon his brothers for a blind girl and a bastard. The final confrontation didn't happen in a warehouse or a dock. It happened on a rainy evening just as Alara was being cleared for discharge. As Min-jun walked toward the car, carrying the baby's car seat, a single black bike roared up the driveway. Min-jun didn't even flinch. He didn't put the baby down. He looked the assassin in the eye with a cold, terrifying calm. He had anticipated this. He had planned for the debt of his past to be collected. "Do it," Min-jun said quietly, standing in front of the car where Alara sat waiting. "But know that the moment you fire, you trigger a mechanism that will ensure your entire family and everyone you've ever spoken to dies within the hour. Elias Thorne and I have made sure of it." The assassin hesitated. In that moment of doubt, Min-jun's hidden security, men who were now paid by Thorne's billions, moved like shadows. It was over in seconds. No gunfire, just the swift, silent removal of a threat. Min-jun got into the car, his heart hammering, but his face a mask of peace. He looked at Alara, who was holding Jihu, her head tilted as if she could sense the violence that had almost occurred. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Everything is perfect," Min-jun lied, but it was a lie he would tell every day for the rest of his life to keep her safe. He took her hand, and as the car drove away from the hospital, he looked back at the city. He was no longer the king of Seoul. He was a man starting a journey into an unknown land, guided by a woman who saw the world with her heart, and a son who was the morning he thought he'd never see. The sound of the city was replaced by the rhythmic, mournful pulse of the East Sea. They had moved to a secluded villa carved into the cliffs of Gangwon Province, a place where the air tasted of salt, and the wind carried the scent of pine and ancient stone. Here, the world was quiet, a silence that Alara finally found comfort in. She spent her days on the wraparound deck, the sun warming her skin as she held Jihu. She could feel the baby growing stronger every day, his tiny fingers grasping at the lace of her dress, his soft gurgles harmonizing with the distant cry of the gulls. To anyone else, they were a wealthy family in retreat. To Min-jun, they were a miracle he was constantly waiting for the universe to reclaim. Min-jun had changed. The sharp, predatory edges of his personality had been sanded down by the soft hands of his son and the unwavering love of the woman who saw him for who he truly was. He no longer wore the tailored Italian suits that felt like armor. He wore soft linens and sweaters, his hair often tousled by the sea breeze. But the transition wasn't easy. In the middle of the night, Alara would feel the bed shift as he sat up, his breath hitched, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he no longer kept under his pillow. The ghosts of the men he had killed and the friends he had lost didn't care about his retirement. They haunted the corners of the villa, a silent audience to his new life. One evening, as the moon cast a shimmering path of silver across the water, Alara found him standing by the cliffside railing. He was holding a sleeping Jihu, the baby's head tucked securely against his shoulder. Min-jun was staring out at the horizon, his expression one of such profound sorrow that Alara felt it in the air before she even reached him. She placed her hand on his arm, her fingers tracing the tension in his muscles. "You're thinking about the debt," she whispered. Min-jun didn't turn, but he leaned into her clutch. "I look at him, Alara, and I see a future I don't deserve. I see a boy who will grow up with a father whose name is a curse in the city. I've tried to bury the boss, but some things don't stay in the ground. I worry that the world will eventually come to collect the interest on my life, and I won't be able to pay it without costing you everything." "You already paid it," Alara said firmly, turning him to face her. She reached up, her hand finding his cheek. "You walked away. You gave up a throne for a cradle. There is no higher penance than choosing to be a good man when it's so much easier to be a monster. Jihu won't see a curse. He'll see a man who loved him enough to change the world. They stood there, a triptych of shadow and light as the ocean roared below. But even in this sanctuary, the shadow of the past was moving. Back in Seoul, the vacuum Minjun had left was being filled by a new, more chaotic generation of criminals who didn't respect the old codes. They saw Minjun as a legend that needed to be dismantled to prove their own strength. They didn't care about the ledger or the deals made with Elias Thorne. They wanted the satisfaction of knowing that the great Kang Minjun had died as a commoner. A few days later, a package arrived at the gate. It wasn't a bomb or a threat. It was a single charred white cane, the very one Ilara had lost in the ditch the night they met. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a message. We know where you are. We haven't forgotten. Minjun felt the old ice return to his veins. He looked at the cane, then at Ilara, who was laughing in the garden as she felt the texture of the blooming camellias. He knew that the only way to truly protect them was to finish the story he had started 20 years ago. He contacted Elias Thorne one last time, making a final, desperate arrangement, a plan that would ensure Ilara and Jihu would be safe forever, even if it meant he would never see them again. The tension in the house grew. Ilara could hear it in the way Minjun's footsteps became heavier, the way he lingered a little longer when he kissed her goodbye in the morning. She knew he was preparing for a final battle, a confrontation that he wouldn't let her be a part of. She didn't try to stop him. She knew that for a man like Minjun, peace had to be bought with a final act of war. The night before he was set to leave for Seoul to settle the score once and for all, they sat in front of the fireplace. The room was warm, the amber light dancing off the walls. Jihu was asleep in his bassinet, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect peace. Minjun held Ilara close, his face buried in her hair, memorizing the scent of her, the feel of her heart against his. "If I don't come back," he began, his voice a jagged whisper. "Don't," she interrupted, pressing her fingers to his lips. "Don't give the darkness that power. You will come back, because a man who found his way through the rain to save a stranger in a ditch can find his way home to the woman who loves him." He didn't respond with words. He kissed her with a desperation that broke her heart, a kiss that tasted of a lifetime of regret and a sliver of impossible hope. He left before dawn, the sound of his car fading into the roar of the surf, leaving Ilara in the silence of the villa, waiting for a symphony that she feared had played its final note. The battle in Seoul was not a loud affair. It was a series of surgical, cold strikes. Minjun didn't go as a boss. He went as a ghost. He dismantled the new rising syndicate from the inside out, using every secret and every shadow he had mastered over the years. It was a bloodbath, but it was silent, a phantom cleaning the streets of his own legacy. By the time the sun rose over the Han River, the threat was gone, erased by the man who created the very world they tried to take. But as Minjun stood on the roof of his old headquarters, the city awakening below him, he felt the weight of his wounds, not just the physical ones from the nights of violence, but the spiritual weight of returning to the person he hated. He looked at his hands, once again stained with the crimson cost of peace. He realized that as long as he lived, he would always be a target. The cycle would truly end when there was nothing left to hunt. He picked up his phone and called Elias Thorne. "It's done," Minjun said, his voice weak. "The path is clear. They are safe. Now do what we agreed. Make me disappear. Truly disappear." The news of the fire at the Kang headquarters dominated the airwaves for weeks. The official report stated that in a final, bloody purge of the criminal underworld, the legendary boss Kang Min-jun had perished alongside his rivals, his body lost to the inferno that consumed the skyscraper. To the world, a monster was gone. To the police, a file was closed. To the streets of Seoul, a throne was empty, and the silence that followed was one of absolute, terrifying peace. But back at the villa in Gangwon, Alara didn't listen to the news. She didn't need the TV to tell her who Min-jun was or where he had gone. She spent her days in a state of suspended animation, moving through the house with a quiet, regal grace, her heart a compass, always pointed toward the city. She raised Jihu with a fierce, protective love, telling him stories of a man who was as strong as the mountains and as gentle as the rain. She taught the boy to listen to the wind, to feel the texture of the world, and to never be afraid of the dark, for the dark was where his father had found his soul. Months turned into a year. Jihu was no longer a fragile infant. He was a sturdy toddler with Min-jun's piercing, intelligent eyes and Alara's soft, knowing smile. He was the living bridge they had promised to build, a legacy of light born from the deepest shadows. Elias Thorne visited often, his cold exterior having thawed into the role of a doting grandfather. He had used his vast influence to ensure that the name Kang was forgotten, replaced by a new identity for Alara and the boy. They were safe. They were free. But for Alara, the freedom felt like a hollow room. On the anniversary of the night they met, the rain returned. It wasn't the violent storm of Seoul, but a soft, rhythmic weeping of the sky over the East Sea. Alara stood on the deck, her mist clinging to her hair, her white cane forgotten in the corner. She didn't need it here. She knew every inch of the sanctuary. She listened to the waves, her mind drifting back to the moment she fell into the ditch and the strong, certain arms that had lifted her out of the mud. Suddenly, the air changed. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that made Alara's heart stop in her chest. It wasn't the salt of the sea or the pine of the forest. It was the faint, unmistakable aroma of expensive sandalwood and rain-washed ozone. It was a scent that belonged to a ghost. "Jihu, stay inside with grandfather," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped off the deck and onto the wet grass of the garden. She moved toward the edge of the cliff, her hands outstretched, searching the air. The rain fell harder, blurring the world, but Alara's senses were heightened to a point of painful clarity. She heard a footstep, a heavy, rhythmic tread that she would know in 1,000 lifetimes. "You're a very difficult man to find, Min-jun," she breathed, her voice catching on a sob. A few feet away, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the pines. He was dressed in simple, dark clothing, his face scarred and his shoulder hunched from wounds that would never fully heal. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found the exit blocked, yet there was a peace in his eyes that had never been there before. He was a ghost, a nobody, a shadow between the buildings. "I told you I was the shadows, Alara," he said, his voice a raspy, beautiful rumble that vibrated in her very marrow. "And the shadows always follow the light." She reached him, her fingers finding his face, tracing the new scars, the stubble on his jaw, and the heat of his skin. He was real. He wasn't a memory. He was the man who died so that he could finally live. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in a year, the hollow room in Alara's heart was filled with the roar of 1,000 suns. "I can't stay," he whispered against her hair, the tears finally breaking from his eyes. "I can never be the man who sits at your table in the daylight. I don't need a name for the world to see. I can only be the guardian you never see, the protector in the woods, the breath in the night." "I know," Alara cried, clinging to him as if she could fuse their souls together. I don't need a husband for the world to see. I don't need a name. I just need to know you're breathing the same air. I just need you to see your son. Min-jun looked past her toward the glass doors of the villa. There, standing with his grandfather, was Ji-hoo. The boy was pressed against the glass, his small hands leaving prints on the surface, his eyes wide as he looked into the rain. He couldn't see the man in the shadows, but he seemed to sense a presence, his little hand waving at the emptiness. Min-jun fell to his knees. A broken sob escaped his lips. He saw his own future in that boy, a future without blood, without chains, without the weight of a crown. He realized that his sacrifice hadn't been a loss, it had been the ultimate investment. He had traded his life for their peace, and in the reflection of the glass, he saw that the trade was the only perfect thing he had ever done. He stood up, kissing Alara for a last time, a kiss that tasted of salt, rain, and forever. I will be in the wind, Alara. I will be in the silence between the waves. Whenever you feel the rain, know that I am holding you. He stepped back, retreating into the tree line as the mist swallowed his form. Alara stood in the garden, the rain washing away her tears, a soft smile playing on her lips. She was blind, but she saw him more clearly than anyone else could ever see. She knew he was there. She knew he would always be there, a silent sentinel watching over her queen and her heir. She walked back into the villa, picking up Ji-hoo and holding him close. The boy pointed toward the dark woods, a curious look on his face. "Dada?" the toddler whispered. Alara kissed his forehead, her eyes turning toward the window where the shadows lived. "Yes, my love," she whispered. "That's the man who saved us. That's the man who loves us from the dark." Outside, the rain continued to fall, a cinematic symphony that blurred the line between the world they lost and the life they found. It was a bittersweet ending, a story written in the mud and finished in the stars, a love that was never meant to be official, but was destined to be eternal. And as the lights of the villa flickered like a beacon in the night, the shadow in the woods watched, waited, and finally, for the first time in his life, found peace.
Thanks for watching. Can you do me a favor? Just say anything at random in the comment. I will reply all. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel.